This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to Kaidan 11. The stories you are about to hear exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to acknowledge. They are echoes from the deep shafts, the quiet trails, and the corners of rooms we thought were empty. Here, the boundary of reality is thin, and the shadows have a memory of their own. Close your eyes and let the silence settle. Some truths are only found in the dark, and once heard, they rarely leave you. Chapter 1. Footsteps in the Deep Shaft. I spent my younger years working the coal mines. It has been over 20 years since they shut the place down, and by now, the site is so overgrown and weathered that you can hardly tell where the entrance used to be. But back in the day, that mine was the lifeblood of the whole town. I started working down there in my early 20s. My father had been a foreman, so it felt like a natural progression for me to head underground. Working in a place that is dark, cramped, and completely cut off from the world does something to a man's head. Until I got used to it, I felt like I couldn't draw a full breath. I still remember one particular night shift vividly. I was in my early 40s then, and I was out at the face of the seam, supervising a few of the younger guys. There were 5 of us in total. There was me and my longtime partner Sam, 2 rookies named Toby and Chris, and our veteran supervisor, Mr. Miller. The tunnels were never truly silent. There was always the low, constant rush of the ventilation fans and the distant, rhythmic drip of water. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from the rock face above us. We all stopped and looked at each other, dead silent. A cave-in is the one thing every miner fears above all else. Work was moving along fine that night. I was focused on the roar of the drills when I thought I heard something else coming from the darkness behind us. It was a rhythmic clack, clack, like the sound of heavy work boots hitting the stone. I turned around and called out to Toby, asking if he'd heard it. He just looked confused and asked if it wasn't just the machinery. But Sam was already scowling. He told me he heard it too. It sounded like footsteps. It felt like someone was walking toward us from the deeper, unlit part of the shaft. But there were only 5 of us assigned to that section. Mr. Miller held up a hand, signaling for us to kill the equipment. "Quiet," he whispered. We strained our ears, and sure enough, the sound came again from the blackness. It wasn't just a random noise. It was a steady, deliberate pace. Clack, clack. The sound of hard soles hitting the ground, getting closer. We swung our headlamps toward the sound, but the beam couldn't pierce the heavy gloom of the tunnel. Mr. Miller shouted out, asking who was there. No one answered. The footsteps just kept coming, slow and steady. Chris, the other rookie, started shaking, his voice cracking as he told us to stop messing around. It felt like the footsteps had reached the very edge of our light, but there was absolutely no one there. Then, with a sharp pop, the lamp on my helmet went dark. I yelled out and started frantically smacking the side of my casing until the light flickered back on. But in those few seconds, everyone's lamps started acting up, flashing and dimming as if the batteries were being drained by the air itself. In the middle of that chaos, I heard it. A low, raspy whisper drifted out of the dark, right next to my ear. It said, I'm still down here. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but then Sam shouted, asking if we'd heard the voice. The rookies were white as ghosts. Mr. Miller didn't hesitate. He barked out an order to drop the tools and get back to the surface immediately. We didn't argue. We scrambled back through the tunnel, and the whole way out, those footsteps followed us. They never ran. They just kept that same hauntingly steady rhythm right behind us. We didn't say a word to each other. We just ran until we saw the lights of the elevator cage. When we finally got back to the locker room and stripped off our gear, we just stood there looking at each other. Toby was still trembling. Sam tried to crack a joke to break the tension, but his voice failed him. Mr. Miller was the only one who seems composed. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and spoke in a low voice. "You heard them," he said. "Those are the ones who never made it out." I asked him what he meant, and he just stared at the smoke rising from his cigarette. He told us that years ago there had been a collapse in that specific shaft. The official report said everyone had been rescued in time, but he trailed off after that, leaving the rest unsaid. I understood then. There are things that happen deep underground that the company records never show, truths known only to the men who were actually there. Not long after that, work in that section of the mine was suspended. They sent a crew down to inspect the area a few days later, but they didn't find a single thing wrong. The power lines were fine, and the structural integrity was solid. The brass officially dismissed our experience as a collective hallucination brought on by fatigue. But from that day on, none of us would ever set foot in that shaft after 2 a.m. We never talked about it again, but the silent agreement was there. It has been over 20 years since the mine closed, and there aren't many people left in town who remember those days. But I can still hear that whisper in my dreams. I'm still down here. I can't help but think that if those tunnels are still down there under the earth, someone is still walking through the dark, waiting to be found. Chapter 2. The Old Pickup and the Carved Totem. A man named Ken lived in a secluded house at the very end of an old logging road. He spent his days tending a small garden and taking odd jobs at construction sites, but his real work was managing the timber on the mountain land his family had owned for generations. Even at 70, he was still out there every day, keeping the forest in check. One afternoon, after finishing a long stretch of clearing brush, Ken sat down to catch his breath. He happened to glance down toward the access road where he'd parked his old pickup truck. There, standing right next to the driver's side door, was a dark figure. It was too far away to make out any features, but the person seemed to be leaning in, peering through the side window into the cab. Worried about vandals or thieves, Ken stood up and hollered at the top of his lungs, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The figure slowly turned its head toward him, as if staring him down from the distance. Ken shouted again, asking what they wanted with his truck. Without a word, the figure stepped away from the vehicle and began to walk. It didn't head down the road. Instead, it veered off into the thicket, descending the opposite slope until it vanished into the heavy timber. When Ken finally packed up his gear and made it down to the truck, he did a full walk-around. Everything seemed fine. The doors were still locked, and nothing had been tampered with. The only thing out of place were a few oily, smeared handprints on the glass of the window, as if someone with very dirty skin had been pressing their face against it. He tossed his tools into the truck bed, climbed inside, and cranked the engine. As he started the bumpy drive down the unpaved trail, he heard something heavy roll out from under the passenger seat and thud against the floorboards. He pulled over and reached down to grab it. It was a wooden carving, about a foot long, shaped roughly like a person. It was crude, almost unfinished, except for one chilling detail. On the smooth, blank space where the face should have been, 2 small X's had been deeply carved into the wood where the eyes belonged. Ken knew for a fact that the carving hadn't been in his truck that morning, but the doors had been locked and there was no way that figure could have slipped it inside. Deeply unsettled, Ken didn't want the thing in his house. On his way home, he pulled over at a bridge and hurled the wooden doll deep into the ravine. But from that day on, the truck wasn't right. Strange things started happening inside the cab. He'd open the ashtray to find it packed tight with wet mud and a foul yellowish sludge. Oily handprints appeared on the inside of the passenger window. On rainy days, the passenger seat would be soaking wet, even though the windows were rolled tight and the roof didn't leak. Once, he walked out to find a stack of newspapers he'd left on the dashboard, torn into 1,000 tiny, jagged pieces, scattered all over the floor. No matter how carefully he locked the doors, the disturbances continued. Then came the accident. Ken was working in a dense patch of woods when his foot caught on a gnarled root. He went down hard, face first. He happened to fall directly onto a cluster of saplings that had been sheared off at a sharp angle during the previous day's clearing. The jagged wood pierced both of his eyes. The doctors couldn't save his sight. Unable to live alone in the wilderness anymore, Ken boarded up the house at the end of the logging road and moved into town to live with his son and daughter-in-law. The old house sat empty, eventually falling into ruin, and the pickup truck was left to rot in the open garage. For years, things were quiet. But not long ago, a local boy was walking past the property with his father around dusk. The boy stopped dead in his tracks and pointed at the rusted truck. "Dad, there's someone sitting in that pickup," he said. The father looked, but the cab was empty, the glass filmed over with years of dust and grime. He told his son he was just seeing shadows, but the boy insisted. When the father asked what the person looked like, the boy thought about it for a second and shook his head. "I couldn't see his face," he whispered, "but he had big, bright white eyes, and he was staring right at us." Chapter 3. The Night Shift and the Condemned Stairwell. I started working night security at a massive suburban shopping mall back in the mid-2010s. I won't mention the specific name because people in the area would recognize it immediately, but at the time, it was the biggest retail hub in the county. During the day, the place was a madhouse of families and teenagers, but at night, the building transformed into something else entirely. When the lights go down and the crowds vanish, that cavernous space becomes unnervingly silent. It's a man-made structure, but in the dark, it feels like it's governed by a different set of rules, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that settles over everything. I was on the graveyard shift, stationed in the security booth from closing until the morning crew arrived. My job was to monitor the feeds and do a full walkthrough every few hours. To be honest, I hated the job at first. There's a specific window between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning when the silence gets loud. You hear the building settling, the structural groans, and the rhythmic thrum of the HVAC system, and your mind starts playing tricks on you. It was September, right after the Labor Day weekend had wrapped up. Around 2:15 a.m., I noticed something on one of the monitors. It was camera 14, which covered the West Wing emergency stairwell. Those stairs lead to an exterior exit, and under normal circumstances, no one should have been in there after hours. But there, on the landing between the third and fourth floors, was a dark silhouette. It looked like a person standing perfectly still. I figured it was a local drunk who had managed to slip inside before lockup and passed out. It had happened before, so I wasn't particularly scared. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and headed out to clear the area. When I reached the West Wing and pushed open the heavy fire door, the stairwell was empty. I climbed all the way to the top, checking every landing and ensuring the roof access was still bolted shut. There wasn't a soul in there. I figured the person must have slipped out an exit I'd missed, so I headed back to the security booth. But when I looked at the monitor again, my blood ran cold. The figure was still there. It was standing on the exact same landing I had just walked through. And this time, it had its head tilted at a slight, unnatural angle, as if it were staring directly into the camera lens, watching me watch it. I called over my partner, a veteran guard named Miller, to take a look. He squinted at the screen and his face went pale. He told me that the stairwell shouldn't even be accessible. 2 years prior, there had been a localized electrical fire in that wing. A transformer had blown and filled the stairwell with toxic smoke. The area had been condemned, and the doors were professionally sealed off with heavy-duty locks and security tape. Physically, there was no way for a person to get in there. So what was I looking at? When we called the tech supervisor the next day, he gave us a logical explanation. He said the DVR system had been acting up ever since the fire. Apparently, when the power surged during the accident, it fried the internal memory of that specific camera. It was supposedly stuck in a feedback loop, playing back a few seconds of footage from the night of the fire over and over again. It sounded plausible, but I knew what I'd seen. That figure hadn't been there when I first started my shift, and a loop wouldn't have reacted to me. A loop doesn't tilt its head to look at you when you return to the desk. The phenomenon continued for weeks. Every night, right after 2 a.m., the figure would appear on the monitor. Its position would change slightly from night to night. Sometimes it would be standing by the railing. Other times it would be slumped against the wall. It was definitely not a recording. Eventually, the sight of it became so unsettling that I started turning off that specific channel during my shift. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to keep the feed on and just watch. Around 3 a.m., the figure moved. It didn't just shift its weight, it started to climb. It moved up the stairs, one slow, deliberate step at a time. There was no sound on the feed, but the movement was fluid and purposeful. I sat there, frozen, as the shadow reached the top of the stairs and vanished from the camera's field of vision. A second later, there was a soft, distinct tap, tap, tap on the door of the security booth. I went completely still, holding my breath. I didn't move a muscle for 10 minutes, but the knocking didn't come again. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door and check the hallway, it was empty. Just the long, fluorescent-lit corridor stretching out into the darkness. The next morning, I caught one of the day shift guys who had been with the mall since it opened. I asked him if anything had ever happened in the West Wing. He got quiet for a moment, then told me the local rumor. On the night of the fire, the official report said there were no casualties. But the word among the old-timers was that a maintenance worker had been trapped in that stairwell. The company had supposedly hushed it up to avoid a massive lawsuit and a PR nightmare. I still work security at that mall. I've learned to live with the odd noises and the feeling of being watched. But every night, when the clock creeps toward 2 a.m., I make sure to reach over and click the power button on that monitor. I don't want to see where that figure is standing. And more than anything, I don't want to be looking at the screen if it ever decides to walk all the way to my door again. Chapter 4. The Guest in the Backcountry Cabin. This is a story my high school outdoor club advisor, Mr. Henderson, told us during a summer trip years ago. He wasn't the type to make things up. He was a retired veteran, very practical and completely no nonsense. He said that back in the day, he was leading a group of students down from a peak in the mountains. The sun was dipping low, and they realized they wouldn't make it back to the trailhead before dark, so they decided to hunker down in an old backcountry cabin along the ridge. When they stepped inside, they saw they weren't alone. There was a man sitting in the corner, leaning back against the log wall. His face was shadowed, but he looked like any other hiker taking a rest. Mr. Henderson, being a polite guy, spoke up. He said, "Evening. Hope you don't mind us sharing the floor with you tonight. We're just staying until daybreak." The man didn't say a word, but he gave a slow, deliberate nod of his head, acknowledging them. Mr. Henderson and the kids rolled out their sleeping bags and settled in. They spent the night right there in the same room with him. The next morning, Mr. Henderson woke up to the rhythmic thrum of a helicopter nearby. He stepped outside and found a whole crew of search and rescue rangers and a couple of local officials gathered in the clearing. Confused, he asked one of the rangers what was going on. The ranger looked at him, surprised. "We're here to recover a hiker," he said. "A guy passed away on the trail yesterday afternoon. We couldn't get the chopper in before the weather turned, so we moved him into this cabin to keep him safe from the elements until we could get back this morning." Mr. Henderson felt the blood drain from his face. He looked back into the cabin. There, in the same corner where the man had been sitting up, was a body lying flat on the floor, neatly covered by a heavy tarp. He and every single one of those students had seen that man sitting up. They had all seen him nod. It even made the local papers back then, though the officials dismissed it as a collective hallucination brought on by the thin air and exhaustion. Mr. Henderson never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. He used to tell us about how he'd seen swamp gas or phosphorus glowing on a piece of rotting wood and knew exactly what it was. But he said he could never find a logical explanation for that cabin. He's been retired for years now, but I still remember the look on his face when he told that story. He wasn't trying to scare us. He was just still trying to figure it out himself. Chapter 5. The Gap in the Trail. This happened last autumn. I was out in the mountains with 6 of my closest friends, a group I'd been hiking with for over 10 years. There were 7 of us in total. I was the sweep that day, the one responsible for bringing up the rear and making sure the line stayed together. We'd been having a great run, bagging a few smaller peaks and sticking perfectly to our planned route. We'd finished lunch and were about 60% through the trek when my legs suddenly started feeling incredibly heavy. It wasn't that I was tired or cramping up. I felt plenty energetic. It was just that every step felt like I was wading through deep, thick mud. At first, I tried to push through it, but within 10 minutes, the weight became so unbearable that I could hardly move. I called out to Mike, our group leader at the front of the line. I yelled that we needed to take 5, but there was no response. It wasn't even that he didn't hear me. It was like I wasn't even there. I shouted again, louder this time, but the whole group just kept walking. They didn't even glance back. In fact, they actually started to pick up the pace, almost jogging, until they disappeared around a bend in the trail. Mike is usually the most attentive guy in the world, always checking on everyone, so the fact that they all just abandoned me was surreal. I decided to stay calm. I dropped my pack, sat on a stump, and took a long drink from my water bottle. I checked my legs for injuries or swelling, but there was nothing. I was perfectly fine, just inexplicably heavy. After about 10 minutes of resting, the sensation began to fade, so I geared back up and started walking slowly to catch up with the rest of them. I hadn't been on the move for more than 5 minutes when I heard the sound of another group approaching from behind. I turned around, expecting to see some strangers on the trail, but I froze. It was my friends. All 6 of them were hiking toward me from the direction I'd just come. I stood there, confused, thinking they must have doubled back to find me. But as they reached me, they just kept walking. I called out to them, but they didn't even look my way. It was like I was invisible. Furious and confused, I started hiking after them. I kept them right at the edge of my vision, pushing myself to keep pace until we finally reached the trailhead parking lot where we'd set up our base camp. The second I got there, I marched up to Mike and demanded to know why the hell they'd been ignoring me all afternoon. Mike just stared at me, looking completely baffled. He told me they hadn't ignored anyone. He insisted that I hadn't been left behind at all, that I'd been right there at the back of the line the entire time. Then he told me that the 7 of us, including me, had been back at camp for over an hour already. I told him he was crazy, that I'd literally just walked into the clearing behind them. The argument went nowhere until Mike's face went pale. He looked at the others and then back at me. He said that about halfway down the mountain, the group had seen me standing way up ahead of them on a ridge, waiting for them. They were so surprised that I'd somehow gotten ahead of them that they'd started running to catch up. But he said that when they reached me, I just stared straight ahead, ignored their questions, and fell back into my position at the rear of the line as they passed. We all stood there in a heavy silence. Then we decided to check the time. We had all synced our watches at the start of the hike that morning to stay on schedule. When we looked at our wrists, my watch was exactly 1 hour behind everyone else's. According to them, I'd been with them the whole time. But I know what I experienced. I was alone on that trail, watching my own life move on without me. Chapter 6. The Shoplifter and the Lingering Gaze. I work part-time at a local grocery store about 3 days a week. I have a son in 3rd grade and a daughter in preschool, and my husband, Mark, works a typical corporate job in the city. My shifts usually involve stocking shelves or helping out at the registers during the lunch rush. I took the job partly for the extra income, but mostly because staying cooped up in the house all day started to make me feel like the walls were closing in. It was a Tuesday morning, and the store was unusually quiet. I was reaching into the back of a shelf to align some canned soup when I turned around and saw something that made me freeze. An older woman was standing in the snack aisle, furtively sliding cans and boxes of crackers into her large handbag. For a split second, I considered looking away and pretending I hadn't seen a thing,
but my legs moved before my brain could stop them. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said, my voice cracking slightly. The woman jumped, her entire body trembling. Her eyes darted around the empty aisle, and her hands went limp. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she whispered. Her voice was thin and shaky. I stepped closer, feeling a mix of adrenaline and pity. "Why would you do this?" I asked. She looked at me with a face that seemed ready to crumble into tears. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed quietly. "We just don't have any money, and I didn't know what else to do." My heart ached for her, but as an employee, I couldn't just let it slide. I had to follow protocol. I called for my supervisor, and we ended up having to bring in the store's security guard. As they led her toward the back office, she kept bowing her head, pleading with me in a desperate, broken voice. "Please," she begged, "don't let my family find out. Please." That voice stayed with me for the rest of the day. A few days later, the strange things started happening at home. At first, it was just minor inconsistencies. I'd wake up to find the half-gallon of milk in the fridge was nearly empty, even though I just bought it the night before. I asked Mark and the kids, but they all insisted they hadn't touched it. Then came the feeling of being watched. Whenever I was alone in the kitchen making dinner, I'd get a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was standing right behind me, staring. Every time I spun around, the room was empty. The unease only grew. One night, I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from the foyer. Mark wasn't home yet, and I knew I'd locked the front door. I crept into the hallway, but no one was there. However, lying on the floor right in front of the door was a small, torn scrap of paper. On it, someone had scribbled a single word in pencil. "Watching." "Is anything weird happening around here lately?" I asked Mark that evening at dinner. He looked up from his plate, confused. "What do you mean?" I told him about the milk, the footsteps, and the note by the door. He just gave me a sympathetic smile and reached for my hand. "You're probably just stressed out, honey. You've been working a lot of extra shifts. You're just tired." I wanted to believe him, but the next morning, Mark woke up in a panic. "Someone took money out of my wallet," he said, staring at his dresser. "I had $100 in here for the week, and now there's only 30. The kids came out of their rooms then. My son, Leo, tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, there was someone crouching by the front door last night." I froze. "Who, Leo?" "I don't know," he said, his eyes wide. "But they were looking at us." After that, the situation spiraled. I'd come home from the store and find items in my grocery bags that I knew I hadn't purchased. Random cans of soup or boxes of crackers I didn't remember scanning. I'd find more notes scrawled on the back of junk mail and coupons left in the mailbox. Still watching. In the middle of the night, the doorknob to the kids' room would rattle and turn over and over, as if someone were trying to see if it was unlocked. I found tiny scratches on the baseboards and faint, dusty footprints in the guest room that didn't match anyone in the house. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman from the store. Was she actually breaking into my house? Or had something happened to her after the police took her away? I wondered if she had died of shame or grief and come back to haunt the person who turned her in. I had no answers, only a growing sense of dread that permeated every room. One night, after Mark and the kids were fast asleep, I sat in the living room with the lights off. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was no longer ours. I stood up and slowly peeled back the edge of the curtain to look out into the yard. There, Standing just beyond the porch light was a dark silhouette. It was the shape of a person, perfectly still, staring directly at the window. "Stop it," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, just stop." I didn't go to bed. I stayed there, clutching a cold cup of tea, watching that shadow until the first light of dawn began to gray the sky. When the sun finally rose, the figure was gone. My life goes on. I get the kids ready for school, I go to my shifts at the store, and I cook dinner every night. But the feeling of being watched never leaves. Every time I open the mailbox, every time I reach into a grocery bag, and every time I turn a corner in my own hallway, my heart skips a beat. I don't know if it's the woman from the store or something else entirely. All I know is that our lives changed the moment I spoke up in that aisle. And every evening, as the sun begins to set, I find myself drawn to the window, peering out into the shadows to see if she's standing there, waiting.
Chapter 7. The Ghost Town Delivery. I work as a courier for a regional logistics company, mostly handling the rural routes that most drivers try to avoid. Pulling long shifts through the dead of night is just part of the job, but even after years on the road, there is one night that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. The manifest was simple, a single small cardboard box. The destination was a tiny cluster of homes tucked deep into a valley in the backcountry, miles away from the nearest highway. My supervisor, a guy named Dave, pulled me aside before I left and told me this was a rare request. He seemed a little on edge about it. The address was precise, but there was no working phone number for the recipient and no special instructions. I turned off the main road and spent nearly an hour winding through narrow, unpaved mountain trails where the trees grew so thick they seemed to swallow the light from my high beams. Finally, I saw it. A lone, weathered timber house standing in a small clearing. It was an old 2-story place with a narrow, vertical window set right next to the front door. There were no street lights, no porch lights, and the house itself was completely dark. There wasn't a single sign of life. Following the standard protocol for a no-contact drop, I walked up to the porch, set the box down by the door, and pulled out my work phone. I needed to take a proof of delivery photo to close out the ticket. As I leaned down to position the box in the frame, my eyes drifted to that narrow window next to the door. I squinted, but the interior was a wall of pure blackness. I couldn't see a thing. I tapped the screen to focus the camera and get the shot. When the image flickered onto the display, my heart nearly stopped. There, in the reflection of the dark window on my screen, was a row of human faces. They were crowded together in the darkness behind the glass, peering out at me. There was no light inside the house to illuminate them, yet on my phone's digital preview, they were clear as day. The faces were pale and distorted, pressed up against the pane with expressions that I can only describe as a mix of desperate longing and hollow emptiness. I lowered the phone and looked at the window with my own eyes. Nothing, just black glass. I lifted the phone again, tilting it slightly. At a certain angle, the faces would vanish, but when I centered the frame on the door, more of them appeared. When the camera struggled to focus and the image blurred, they seemed to fade, but every time the shutter clicked, a few more faces would manifest for a split second in the flash. A cold, primal terror washed over me. I didn't wait to see anything else. I backed away slowly, then turned and bolted for my truck. I scrambled into the cab, threw the engine into gear, and slammed on the gas. As I sped away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The box I had just left on the porch was gone. In its place, a group of people were standing in a line in front of the door. They were perfectly still, watching the truck retreat, and then, in unison, they began to wave. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow, rhythmic, and mechanical. I didn't see the door open. I didn't see anyone come out. They were just there. When I got back to the depot and told Dave what happened, he didn't look surprised. He just sighed, leaned back in his chair, and muttered, "Not that delivery again." He wouldn't give me any details, but he marked the package as delivered in the system and told me to forget about it. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled up a detailed satellite map of the area on my computer. I zoomed in on the coordinates of that house, but the screen didn't show a residence. Instead, the entire area was marked with a red boundary and a single label, Ghost Town. According to the historical records, the settlement had been abandoned in the late 70s after a flash flood cut off the main access road and the local mill shut down. I still have to drive through those mountains for the night shift sometimes. Every time the GPS points me toward that valley, a heavy, suffocating weight settles in my chest. I can't stop thinking about those houses in the dark and the faces that only show up on a screen, still waiting for a delivery that never truly ends. Chapter 8. The Taboo of the Lantern-Lit Hollow. I'm a sales representative in my mid-40s, and my territory takes me deep into the rural backcountry. Because of the nature of my job, I often find myself navigating tiny settlements that barely show up on a GPS. That night was no exception. I just finished a late meeting with a client and was winding my way through the mountain passes toward my hotel when I realized my gas gauge was sitting on empty. The few stations I'd passed earlier were already closed for the night. Getting desperate, I turned onto a narrow side road, hoping to find a local pump or a farmhouse. In the distance, I saw a cluster of lights nestled in a valley. I crossed a small, rickety wooden bridge and entered a tiny hamlet of about 10 houses. The road wasn't paved. It was just packed red clay, and the houses were all ancient timber structures that looked like they'd been standing since the frontier days. It was well past 9 p.m., but strangely, every single window was glowing with a warm orange light. It wasn't the harsh buzz of electricity. It was clearly the flickering, dancing glow of oil lamps or lanterns. I pulled my car over and stepped out, but the silence was absolute. There were no dogs barking, no sound of a television, no crickets, nothing. Just those windows pulsing with silent light. I walked up to the first porch and called out as loud as I could. "Excuse me, is there anywhere nearby where I could buy some gas?" No one answered. I strained my ears and heard a faint rustling from inside, like dry husks rubbing together. I tried the second house, then the third. It was the same everywhere. I could see blurry, indistinct shadows moving behind the glass, but no matter how much I shouted or knocked, no one came to the door. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had a sudden, overwhelming instinct that I shouldn't be in this place after dark. But looking at my gas gauge, I knew I wouldn't make it back to the main highway. I decided to try one last time and walked toward a small clearing that looked like a town square.
In the center stood a small stone monument, slick with moss and age. A single, thick candle was burning inside a small alcove. The flame whipped back and forth violently, as if in a gale, even though the night air was perfectly still. As I stepped closer, the flame sputtered and nearly died. That's when I heard it. A voice, right behind my ear, whispered my name. Hey. It was a low, rattling sound, neither male nor female. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the square was empty. The windows of the houses continued to glow, and those dark shadows inside were swaying in a rhythmic, unnatural way. I turned to run back to my car, but the road I'd come in on was gone. I'd crossed a bridge to get here, but now there was no sign of a creek, no sound of running water. Instead, a new sound began to echo from every house at once. Clack, clack. It was the sound of wood striking wood, a steady, synchronized beat, as if everyone in the village was signaling to one another. Terrified, I bolted behind the stone monument and saw a single house standing apart from the rest. It was the only one that was dark. The roof was half collapsed, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. I scrambled inside and huddled in the corner. The floorboards were rotted and thick with decades of dust. There was no sign that anyone had lived there for a long time, yet, for some reason, this ruin felt like the only safe place in the valley. I held my breath as the clacking sound outside grew louder, then slowly began to fade into the distance. As my heart rate slowed, I noticed a weathered wooden sign propped up against the wall. The letters had been scrawled in charcoal, barely legible. Do not light the lamps at night. Do not step outside at night. It hit me then. Those lights in the other houses weren't for the living. They were a facade, a way to mimic a home, to keep something trapped or occupied. This ruined shack was the only place where the cycle had been broken. I must have drifted off out of sheer exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, the sun was cresting over the eastern ridge. The birds were singing again. I stepped outside and gasped. The village I'd seen the night before was gone. In its place was a graveyard of rotted gray wood. The houses were mere skeletons, their roofs caved in and windows shattered. There was no orange glow, no shadows. The stone monument was there, but there was no candle, not even a trace of melted wax. I looked down and saw the wooden sign from the shack lying at my feet. I flipped it over. On the back, someone had carved a final warning. Stranger, now that you have seen us, never come back. I practically flew back to my car, which was parked exactly where I'd left it. I managed to coast on fumes until I found a gas station 5 miles down the road. When I asked the attendant about the settlement in the valley, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. There hasn't been anyone living up that hollow for 50 years, he said. The whole place was abandoned after a flu outbreak back in the 50s. It's just a ghost town now. Ever since that night, the orange lights have followed me. Every time I close my eyes, I see that flickering glow behind a window and a dark silhouette watching me from the shadows. I tell myself it's just a dream, but when I wake up in the dead of night, I can hear it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the floorboards right next to my bed. Clack, clack. I've promised myself I'll never go back to those mountains, but deep down, I know it doesn't matter. Those shadows know I saw them, and I'm starting to think they're tired of being the only ones left in the dark. We've walked through shadows where the past lingers, and silence speaks volumes. These stories remind us that some doors, once opened, can never truly be shut. Thank you for listening. As you return to the familiar world, carry with you this quiet question. What unseen footsteps echo just behind your own, and what waits patiently in the corners of your perception?